Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. It is a glorious day here and beautiful spring wattle flowers and finally some sunshine. So I hope we can draw inspiration from the beautiful country in which we're meeting, and particularly excited to be able to introduce Erin to speak on the topic of settler state water laws and the problem of Aqua Nullius. Erin O'Donnell is a senior lecturer and an ARC DECRA fellow at the University of Melbourne. She's an internationally recognised expert in water rights law and rights for nature. I'm also particularly pleased to invite Erin up here to work with Carla and Catherine and I on Carla's last paper for her PhD. So we're having a lovely time. And I also want to just really thank Erin for being such a kind and welcoming person into the world of understanding relationships between the settler state and Indigenous nations here in Australia. It's not often that you see people who work in this space be so open and welcoming, and I really have valued the relationship that we've developed over the last couple of years and learning from Erin and working with her. I hope we will continue to do so in the future. So, Erin. Thank you. No worries.
So thank you so much for having me here with you today. I'm really looking forward to hopefully a bit of a lively Q&A. I've got a whole bunch of slides, some of which we may see and some of which we might get sidetracked from, depending on where you'd like to take the conversation. So I encourage you at any point to, stick your hand up, ask a question, send me off in a completely different direction. The theme of today's conversation is really, not only is Aqua Nullius, and I'll go into what that is in a second, an injustice. It is a grave injustice. It is an ongoing and contemporary violence against Indigenous peoples. It is not something that is relegated to the past. It is also a major problem for settlers in settler colonial societies like Australia. It undermines the legitimacy and sustainability of our water laws. It contributes to a disconnect that all people experience with place, and it contributes to our failure to come to grips with history here in Australia, but also with the present. So with that sombre beginning, I too will acknowledge country. We're meeting today on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also offer my respects to any Aboriginal people who are here with us in the room today. I'm also going to acknowledge, as I try to do wherever I can, that we are having these conversations in a time of genocide. The rights of Indigenous peoples are threatened in many ways across the world, and we are witnessing a genocide in real time in Palestine. So as part of my acknowledgement, I like to acknowledge that reality as well, the privilege that we have to continue to do business as usual in the face of unthinkable agonies. But here we are on Indigenous land, and we're going to talk about water. So in speaking about Aqua Nullius, I also need to acknowledge the leading thinker in this space, which is Virginia Marshall. And she, of course, has been, I think she still is a scholar here at ANU. Her book really was the one that put Aqua Nullius on the scene for water professionals everywhere to have to engage with. Instead of seeing it, again, as a sort of side note to Terra Nullius, or even not even a thing that we were thinking about, her work said this is front and centre, and you must acknowledge that Aqua Nullius is part of the Terra Nullius conversation. So what Aqua Nullius is this erroneous assumption that the water belonged to no one when the British invaded Australia. And that erroneous assumption continues to play out in our laws today. And so although it began historically, its effects are ongoing. We see this water theft across multiple dimensions. We see it in terms of authority. So this is a quote from Auntie Yvonne Barker, a Gunditj Mara woman: stolen lands, stolen waters, and stolen authority too. So the ability to exercise power, to just make decisions about how water is cared for, the opportunity to determine the relationship that we have with water, that was what was stolen. That is what is the theft of Aqua Nullius represents. The reconstruction of water as a commodity is also part of Aqua Nullius. And this comes from Annie Denise Lovett, another Gunditj Mara woman. Only through the frontier wars was water then constructed as a commodity. So that connection between the violence of the invasion and the enduring nature of the settler state water laws is something that is still apparent for Indigenous people today. It has significant practical impacts for Indigenous communities. And many of you, if you're working in the Murray-Darling Basin, you will have been aware for many years there's been conversations about water justice and the recognition of water for economic development, which is also a thing that our federal government now seems to be veering back towards as a mechanism of addressing injustice. So ongoing water dispossession has undermined Indigenous economies. So it is a practical thing, it is a power question, and it is manifesting today in multiple ways. So the big questions that my research is engaging with, and this is the theme of my DECRA, I'm working with Indigenous peoples across the world in settler colonial societies, but also here in Australia specifically. And I've put here Australia's kind of Victoria in brackets, because when I started this process a couple of years ago, many states and territories around Australia were investing in significant truth-telling and treaty-making processes. And that has significantly decreased. So Victoria is now really leading the way, thanks to the leadership of traditional owners in Victoria who have persisted and never given up and who are continually pushing the state government on that level. So I'll focus mostly on the opportunities that I see in the Victorian context. So treaty processes, how do they engage with water and water rights? Are they a genuine opportunity to overturn or overcome or end Aqua Nullius? What lessons can traditional owners and First Nations in Australia, my glasses are not helping in any way, that's disappointing. What lessons can they learn from the experiences of Indigenous peoples in other settler colonial states? So my research is working with people in the US, as well as in Aotearoa New Zealand, to identify insights that have come from places where treaties have been established for many, many years, for over several hundred years in the case of the US. How is that playing out now in the context of Aqua Nullius? And obviously the short answer is, it's yes and no. There are some insights. There are also some significant warnings for people in Australia to take heed of. And can traditional owners continue to drive that law and policy reform to really address the problems of Aqua Nullius? And how can we do that with them? How can settlers like me work with traditional owners to overcome these problems of Aqua Nullius? And this is where we get to this question of what does Aqua Nullius do to settlers as well as Indigenous people in Australia? It creates two major problems for settler state water law: legitimacy of our legal system and sustainability of our water management arrangements. And at the moment, we are failing on both levels. Our water laws are not legitimate because they fail to acknowledge and deal with Aqua Nullius, and they are leading to significantly unsustainable outcomes. So when we think about the contemporary nature of Aqua Nullius, we can see it in legislation. Every single state and territory around Australia, except South Australia, has a specific section in their water legislation that vests the ownership or the right to control water in the Crown. This is the contemporary statement of Aqua Nullius, because everything else in that water legislation hinges on that. And so even though South Australia doesn't specifically state it any longer, their legislation still assumes that that exists. So this is Aqua Nullius today in our legal systems, and we depend on it. So entitlements to water, water markets, the ability to care for something as complex as the Murray-Darling Basin, these things hinge on those powers of the Crown to control the way that water is used. If that is illegitimate, then our entire water system can be questioned, should perhaps be questioned. So Aqua Nullius creates a major problem for the settler state because our water laws are not sitting on a strong foundation. As treaty processes progress, I would anticipate that this foundation will be significantly challenged here in Australia. And it has to be, right? This is the enactment of a lie. This is the enactment of a theft of water, a theft of the physical water and the authority to care for water. And it's contemporary and ongoing. We don't really have to go too far to find sustainability problems. The Murray-Darling Basin is kind of a watchword in the challenges of managing water sustainably. And Quentin is going to be giving a fantastic National Press Club address in a few weeks talking about those problems. And we can see it in times of drought as well as in times of flood. So we've seen major fish kills coming after major floods as well as major droughts. That tells us the system is in crisis. Our systems are simply not equipped to deal with, to care for these rivers. I'm going to just acknowledge the language shift that I'm attempting to make here as well. So I'm a settler. I've been thoroughly schooled in Western science and the language of water resource management. When you speak with Indigenous peoples from around the world, it is a relationship with rivers. It is an obligation and it is an act of care. It is a reciprocal engagement with rivers and water systems. So that is something that I'm also trying to bring in, because I think it challenges the foundations of what management is, because management is an expression of control, whereas care is an expression of love. It's an acknowledgement of interdependence. And I think that's our pathway through some of these sustainability problems, but we can't actually get there without dealing with Aqua Nullius. So when we look at the way that Indigenous peoples talk about water and frame water, this cultural water paradigm is the work of Melissa Kennedy. She's a Taddy woman. So her people, their country is around Magoya Lagoon along the Murray. So it's a little bit, trying to get this right, to the east of Mildura, to the west of Swan Hill. So in working with Mel and Renee Woods and several others, we published this in Science last year. This is a holistic way of thinking about water. So it brings care into it. It brings a way of seeing water in which, instead of seeing different uses that are traded off against each other, we see a holistic way of saying we have to achieve all of these outcomes. So optimization is different to trade-off. And this particular diagram came from an attempt to explain to settlers, again, like me, let's think about what we do in the settler state water system. We create buckets of water for different uses. We've got our environmental water, we've got our water for households and people, and we've got commercial uses like irrigation and other industry uses of water. And we trade off. We say, well, if we can get a big enough commercial gain, that offsets impact to the environment. We're trading one against the other. The cultural water paradigm says we have to bring all of these things into being at the same time. So they act as constraints on each other, but they're not traded off against each other. So this is an integrated way of seeing river and water systems. It is also a really powerful diagram that says there are elements of these three buckets within a cultural water paradigm, but they are not the same. So environmental water has intersections with the idea of healthy country and the need for water for healthy country, but it's not the same. Healthy country is informed by a relationship between people and place. Environmental water, although it is starting to be informed by that thinking, is still very much a Western science, ecological driven understanding of what an ecosystem needs, often to the exclusion of humans, right? Whereas healthy country, humans are part of healthy country. Healthy country creates space for people as well as other aspects of the ecosystem. And it's the same in these other elements. This one is really important to underscore as well. Cultural economies, economic uses of water or aquaculture or things that depend on healthy water systems have always been part of Indigenous cultures and legal systems. They have not been capitalist extractivist economies. And that's what we see mostly playing out in commercial uses of water now. But there's always been some excess production. There's always been the ability to support trade. It's just that it's been part of a holistic enterprise. So this is a vision for what it could look like. This is what acknowledging and addressing Aqua Nullius could lead to. A much more integrated way of understanding water in which we are part of a relationship that includes many elements and that brings sustainability and legitimacy together and starts resolving those problems. Anybody who's been working in settler state water resource management, integrated water resource management has been like the holy grail for decades. Cultural water paradigm is a way of actually achieving that. And it highlights, I think, for me, one of the reasons why we've struggled to achieve it. And that's because we keep seeing it as a form of trade-off. So how do we get there? This diagram comes from some fantastic work that came out in 2018. This particular report, and I'm acknowledging the image credit particularly came from Rebecca Nelson because she's brilliant and I use this everywhere. But this was a project that was led by Milgren and Nailsba and NBAN it was part of the National Cultural Flows Research Project. And they wanted to understand the different pathways to water justice. So how can we transition? How can we identify what each of these elements might look like? You'll notice, because Rebecca is very clever, that these circles are not linear. They're not you achieve one and then you get the other, or you can't start on this one while you're halfway through something else. It looks at the circles as an intersecting way of seeing water justice and says, you could certainly start with water rights if you want, because they are within the settler state system. So to a certain extent, they are an easy place to begin. And we've got the Aboriginal Water Entitlement Program, which any day now, we'll start purchasing water. We've got a number of water rights returns that have happened throughout Australia at various points. So legally, it is an easy thing. Is it acknowledging Aqua Nullius? I'm seeing some heads shaking. No, because it's entirely within the settler state system. So what you need to start bringing together then is influence in waterscapes. So how is water actually cared for? Who has power in doing that? And transforming that foundation, which goes back to those sections in the legislation that says that the power to control water vests in the Crown. And trying to think about all three of these at the same time. And sometimes you find a way in through one pathway and then another, and opens up opportunities. These are the elements to overcoming the challenges of Aqua Nullius. Not necessarily solely, but these are the pathways that we can explore. So when we then think about it in the context of treaty, can we look around the world and see opportunities for treaty to start progressing us along that water justice pathway in each of those three circles? So when we look around at Aotearoa New Zealand, at Canada, at the United States of America, we can see treaties leading to change on each of those dimensions. In Aotearoa, the Wanganui River, Te Awa Tupua, is a great example of transforming the foundation. Now, one of the things it doesn't do is actually challenge water rights in that system. It transforms the relationship between people and the river, but the legislation explicitly preserves existing water rights in that system. So it's still a limited step, but it's starting to transform the foundation of what the settler state understands water to be. Instead of water being a resource for human domination and exploitation, with the Te Awa Tupua legislation, the Wanganui River is a living and indivisible whole from the mountains to the sea, including all its physical and metaphysical elements. That's section 12 of the legislation. Metaphysical elements, that's the relationship between people and the river. If you speak to Wanganui iwi, they will tell you that is the section that they wanted. That was the acknowledgement of their relationship. They have been arguing for 150 years in one of the longest running series of court cases relating to treaty disputes. They've been arguing for their relationship to be considered relevant, and they've been told repeatedly that it was not. So this transformation is crucial for them as an acknowledgement of the importance and centrality of that relationship, but also because it's starting to shift the way that the settler state understands water. There are now a plural way of seeing water within Aotearoa New Zealand. And we're starting to see the same things in Australia as well. Let's go quickly to Canada. We're hopscotching around the world. Increasing influence in waterscapes. So British Columbia in Canada has recently committed to implementing UNDRIP. And this is the specific example on this slide comes from the Yukon, but British Columbia is working very hard to change its system of water governance and to bring First Nations and tribes perspectives into that process. The Yukon Water Board shows a way of doing that. So they call it a co-relational water board, where you've got the Government of Canada, the national body, the Government of Yukon, the territory body, and the Council of Yukon First Nations, all three forming part of that governing entity for the water board. So it's a way of sharing authority. And in that sense, it is a transfer of power in the influence for the care and management of waterscapes. But again, it's limited because it's still essentially bringing in First Nations people into a settler construct. So trying to challenge the foundations of the way that settler construct works, that will be the key to the success of this one. And so far, we're not seeing a lot on that side of it. A lot of hope, but still, as Wilson puts it, the marginalisation of Indigenous legal orders. And then moving right back into the context of the settler state, we can see water rights. And one of the great examples comes from the United States of America. So one of the things that I've been facilitating is an exchange between traditional owners in Australia and tribes in the US. And so one of the big insights for people in Australia was that in the Colorado River, about 25% of the flow of the river is actually tribal water rights. And that is, that will only grow. It's currently an underestimate because of the nature of the long drawn out negotiations to settle tribal water right claims. So they own enormous amounts of water. Compare that to the Murray-Darling Basin, where it's less than 0.2% of entitlements on issue are held by First Nations in the Murray-Darling Basin. So this is a significant, it's a significant opportunity. It's a significant difference, and it's driven by treaty and reservation agreements in the United States because, and I can go into some more detail here, but I'll probably skip over it. The idea was when government put tribes onto reservations, there was an implied assumption that they would have enough resources to do what they needed to. And water is part of that. And so they received those rights dating back to the start of that reservation or to that treaty. Some of them are older still. So on the one hand, significant volumes of water that can support economic development, and there are certainly economic developments that tribes are leading in the United States, but they are settler water rights. So they are granted on the basis of what is called a practically irrigable area. So you have to show within your reservation how much of that land is actually available for irrigation. And that is the basis on which you are given these rights, and that is the use to which this water can be put. It is not a cultural flow. It is water that they can use for irrigation. And they're still within the settler state water framework. So it certainly gives tribes a seat at the table, and tribes have been using their water rights to leverage greater power in negotiations, particularly in the Colorado. So you've got cities that are looking like potentially running out of water. The tribes are saying, well, maybe we could make our water available to this city to keep the taps turned on. If that comes with a recognition of our power and a role in the governance of the Colorado River. But that's an ongoing negotiation, and they have to keep fighting their way in, even though they own so much of the water in the system. They still, in many cases, lack the infrastructure to use it as well. So even though they have a lot of water, even though it can only be used for irrigation, if you don't have the infrastructure to actually get it where it needs to go, the economic outcomes are still very limited. So treaty can open doors, but it doesn't necessarily address Aqua Nullius without ongoing efforts both from Indigenous peoples, but also from the settler state, and acknowledging that the legal system has to change. And I think many of these, even in the presence of a treaty, it doesn't mean that Aqua Nullius can't exist. It doesn't exist in the same way as it does here in Australia, but there is still that theft of authority around how water is managed. In each of these examples, in Canada, in the US, in Aotearoa, the theft of that authority has continued, even in the presence of treaties. So when we look at Australia then, and this is where we're going to dive back into Victoria, can we see evidence of these three circles or three pathways to water justice being tackled in the current process? There is a treaty and truth-telling process that is well established in Victoria. So treaty negotiations have formally begun this year between the First Peoples Assembly and the state of Victoria. Water will play a part in that. What comes out of it, we'll see. It's incredibly difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, right? So without speaking for anyone, I would thoroughly anticipate that there would be a very staged process. There might be some formal shifts that would potentially give rise to some very long-term changes. So formal acknowledgements of power or power sharing that will only gradually lead to changes in the way that water is managed. That would be my expectation, because I think otherwise becomes politically unfeasible for the Victorian government to do. But that's not up to me, so we'll watch this space. This is the only opportunity, though, to really tackle Aqua Nullius as it is expressed in Section 7 of the Victorian Water Act. Increasing influence in water landscapes is a really exciting space, I think, in the Victorian context. So Victoria is home to Australia's first and so far only, although I think that is about to change, river that has been recognised as a living entity. So the Birrarung, the Yarra River that flows through the heart of Naarm or Melbourne, supplies 70% of Melbourne's drinking water, is a very degraded river by many estimations, but is beloved and is now recognised as a living entity in the settler law. So that came about in 2017. There are a number of other commitments in Victoria as well to extend this idea of rivers as living entities, but also to acknowledge traditional owners as a unique voice of those rivers. The Birrarung is a living entity because of the leadership of Wurundjeri people. They were belatedly invited into the government processes to design this new legislation, but once in, they made an enormous impact by changing the way that the river was being constructed in that legislation. It is limited. This Birrarung legislation does not connect to the Victorian Water Act at all. So it's fundamentally transformed a river out from a resource into a living being, but it doesn't actually legally have any connection to the Water Act that continues to treat it as a resource. Doesn't interrupt anybody's water rights. I will acknowledge that I'm a member of the Birrarung Council. One of the pieces of work that we did after we'd been in place for a couple of years was to try and think about how do we avoid those problems that Canada is experiencing where Indigenous legal orders are marginalised. What would it look like for this council, the voice of the river, to be a genuinely bicultural body in which Indigenous members and non-Indigenous members walk together? And how do we create something that is new? And one of the ways that you do that is by bringing in ceremony, by bringing in Indigenous law, by elevating the voices of elders. So we currently have 4 Indigenous elders, 3 Wurundjeri, 1 Birrarung on the council. We have another Indigenous member. We have 2 Indigenous staff. We did an enormous amount of work to change the way that we operate, to bring the river physically into our meetings as much as possible, and to create space for culture and ceremony so that it's not just a white fella board meeting. And of course, Victoria has returned water rights. This diagram, I'm so happy to say, is now out of date because we've had more water rights returned down here in Gippsland, including the first groundwater right issued to traditional owners in Victoria. So it is an exciting process in the sense that very little had happened and now more and more is happening. But every single time water rights get returned to traditional owners in Victoria, the process takes over a year. If you look at the settler state legal processes, you could go out and apply for a water license and you would expect in uncontroversial circumstances, which all of these are, that you would find out within about 3 months that you would have your license issued. The Northern Victorian one is probably the only potentially controversial, but every single other one has been unallocated water. They know it's there. They know it's sustainable to allocate it to someone else. Nobody else has wanted it. It's been unallocated for years, if not decades. Nobody's contesting the Aboriginal application for the licenses, and yet still over a year because they sit inside bureaucracies and nothing happens. It's very difficult not to see that as a form of racism in action because it's difficult for people to get their heads around it. And so it becomes, we just keep setting it aside. So we can see then within each of those 3 circles, we can see water rights beginning to be transferred. We can see increasing influence in the way that waterscapes are cared for, managed. We have the opportunity to start tackling that foundational problem of Aqua Nullius. But to do so, we need to, I think, again, keep coming back to why is it important for settler state law as well? It's the only way to solve our legitimacy problems, our sustainability problems, is to acknowledge Aqua Nullius and then begin to address it. So what I will leave you with is the last thing. This is a document that I was seconded into the Victorian government to help write as part of a majority traditional owner writing team. As far as I know, I really hope this is going to change, so tell me if I'm now wrong, because I'd love it. This is the only government document in Australia that formally acknowledges Aqua Nullius. Doesn't address it, doesn't commit to addressing it, but it does acknowledge it. And sometimes starting to tell the truth is the most powerful place to begin. So with that, I think I'll finish up. Thank you very much.
Do you want to field your own questions, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to field.
You're happy to field.
Yep.
Okay.
That was a yes to a choice question. Yeah. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
That was really fascinating and inspiring. I wondered from your experience, how important is it as you think about those transitions through sort of rights to foundations, influence foundations? How important is it to have traditional owners, First Nations, organised entities, if you like? So the very little that I've had to do with looking into this, there often seems when we see progress being made, that there's an Indigenous-led entity that is organised and you know, claiming that authority, because it's not going to be given to them, as you say. So how important is that in the context that you work in to have these, to have groups and these kind of organisational entities like the council, like the other institutions?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I think it allows me to elaborate on something that I think I probably skimmed over with this, which is that it's crucial. So when we say sovereignty was never ceded, it means those sovereign nations continue to exist. But for them, to make progress on these issues, it does rest a lot on the shoulders of those nations to advocate for their interests, to express their sovereignty, to continue to remind the governments of Australia that their sovereignty exists. So having some kind of formal structure, and many mob do it in different ways. So it's not about one size fits all, but having a formal structure that gives them the resourcing that they need to keep pushing for this, to keep pushing for their version of this, their version of the change that they need, and that transfer of power and authority to those nations and those nation entities. It's crucial. It's a major challenge, obviously, for traditional owners across Australia, because they're constituted in very different ways by the settler state. There are groups that have formal status, so there are groups that do not have formally settler state recognised status for varying reasons, some because they choose not to. So yeah, it is crucial, and I think to make that kind of progress, the work that I've been involved in has really depended on, to a very large extent, the settler state making funding available to the right kind of peak bodies that can then disperse that to the nations as well. So I do a lot of work with Mildred. I do a lot of work with the Federation of Traditional Owner Corporations in Victoria. Both of those entities then funnel stuff through to their members or support their members in advocating. So if I skip to this slide, Part B of Water is Life is 27 nation statements from traditional owner groups across Victoria. Some of them have formal status, some of them don't. They were all supported to prepare a document in their own words, which was then published alongside the government policy, to say these are our expectations and demands from government in relation to water. This is how we understand water, and this is what we expect from the settler state. So enabling that to happen is crucial for progressing water justice and for tackling Aqua Nullius. Catherine.
Thank you, Erin. That's great. I was really interested in your US examples and the need to irrigate and the lack of capability and stuff. Can you dig in a little bit more as to what we could potentially learn there around what kinds of barriers, what kinds of restrictions, things could play out here in a similar way that could give potential ownership but not actual enablement, to create that cultural water outcomes.
And so Karina's just asking me, can I repeat the question for people online? So what can we learn from the US is basically the question. So I think I mean, there's a few things, and one of them that we're well set up for already in Australia is the way our water rights systems work. So in the US, it's a first in time, first in right. So the first person to use it going back in time and who has continually used it has the highest security water on the system. So they get to take everything. Then if there's anything left, the next person, and so on and so forth. So when you insert new Indigenous rights into that system, you basically bump everybody significantly down that chain. So there will be substantial numbers of people in a river system, once Indigenous rights are formally recognised, who can no longer access any water at all. So it's a very binary outcome. You get some or you get nothing. It's not like here where we have a sharing of water. So in some ways, it will be slightly easier, not easy, but slightly easier in Australia because at least the sharing will continue and it won't be such a binary outcome. But on the other hand, yeah, it does also show that a treaty is a starting point, but it's usually a gateway to continued litigation. So we don't have a strong history of that in Australia when it comes to water. Like litigation hasn't played a massive role. There are obviously key exceptions to that, but largely it hasn't. And particularly for First Nations, because they've had no legal hook really to claim significant legal rights. It hasn't been dismissed in various ways. They've certainly exercised enormous agency in trying to find those things. So whether that's, I don't know whether that's a good thing or not though, ultimately, because a treaty that creates a legal right that you then have to keep relitigating and fighting for can lock you into generational trauma. We see that with native title, the decades that it takes for a claim to go through, can end up re-traumatizing people. So it's not a panacea, I think, is the outcome that I'm seeing from the US. One of the things that the US learned from us, which was really interesting. So I think in my head, I was like, wow, we're going to learn so much from you guys because you've got so much water rights, and how do we start to get there? They came here and were blown away by cultural flows as an idea. The idea that water has a place in the system, that you can marshal Indigenous legal orders to say this is how water should move through this system. And it's part of our caring for this water that this happens. And so the idea of cultural flows has migrated back to the US, and there are tribes that have come out here that are really excited about not necessarily taking more water, but changing the way that water moves through the system, and to reassert a cultural authority over that.
Oh, actually, Jason,
Yeah.
I have a question, but I can.
Thanks, Erin. When I was working with the Manawarra Destroy Council, it became apparent that there was international law on heritage, there was national law on things like heritage, native title, there was state law, particularly statutory rights, grazing, water, mining, and then there was Indigenous law, and that these were all overlapping in a very messy, incoherent way, and the decisions about what to do with a river or a water right had implications for all of them.
Yeah.
And I guess going back to your scholarship on law and law reform, do you see, or can you tell us what you see as the kind of research and law reform agenda that might be going some way towards sorting that mess out?
Yeah, I mean, from a legal perspective, so for the online people, the question is how do we sort out the messy, overlapping and incoherent layers of legal orders, I think. So treaty has to be part of that equation, because that is the thing that will formally enable the settler state to see Indigenous law at the level of the settler state, to acknowledge it at that level. So it becomes more than just a set of beliefs or cultural values. It becomes, no, this is a legal system that operates alongside. So treaty both acknowledges, but also enables the bridges to be built. So like my position is that we need treaty everywhere across Australia. It's happening at the state level in Victoria, largely because it wasn't happening at the federal level, the national level. It needs to happen at that national level, but we'll see how far we get in Victoria. I think that is the cleanest way to make sense of it and to give Indigenous laws the recognition that they deserve. It is a nation-to-nation level of interaction. And I think that's the thing that Australia has lost sight of with Indigenous peoples. They are too often seen as stakeholders and minority groups rather than political entities. And this was one of the reasons the voice debate ended up where it did, because people aren't used to seeing Indigenous nations as sovereign entities. So I think that's the key. But I think the other element of that, and this draws on work by Val Napoleon, a First Nations legal scholar from Canada. She works with a lot of tribes and First Nations groups to articulate Indigenous legal orders, to work with those communities to say, look, you've got ways of doing things, and your laws have often been stolen from you as part of colonisation, but you've retained them through the stories, through the ways of doing things, through the norms that you have. So let's re-articulate them so that we can then start to ask the hard questions of what those legal orders are, how they operate, are they fit for purpose in a contemporary setting? How do you undertake Indigenous law reform, for instance? So I think that's a really powerful model. I'd love to see that here in Australia more, because I think many nations have significant legal orders around water, particularly like these nation statements are the beginning of that kind of process, and articulating those legal orders. And then once the Indigenous group who holds them is, so once that nation is comfortable enough to start asking the hard questions, then you can also start asking really hard questions about, well, how does it interact with the settler state law? At the moment, the settler state law is so well defined, and the history and contemporary nature is so violent in the way that it interacts with Indigenous peoples that it's very difficult to have a robust conversation about how these legal systems fit together. So strengthen and amplify and elevate, get a treaty in place, and then you can start to resolve that. So just like a few little things, like no big deal.
Can I just ask a follow-on from that? Given how long we know and understand, we can see the treaty processes playing out and potential question marks about where they could go, like failing that ideal, what's the practical ways to work with the kind of dilemma that Desmond's articulated?
So in the absence of a treaty?
In the absence of a treaty, where do we go from there? Because I think we need both fronts, right? Because this is going to take a long time and may not go in this is going to take a long time.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that, right? So
Yeah.
what is this? What happens here to improve the status quo?
So there's lots of different ways of agreement making. And so the question for online was, what can we do in the absence of a treaty? I think a treaty is a powerful legal document because of that sovereign to sovereign way of operating. Mobs haven't needed to wait for treaty to set up their own agreement making. And Nowdonjerry is a great example of that. So they have that binding legal agreement with the settler state in South Australia that gives them a way of interacting, if not precisely on a nation-to-nation level, at least from a legal entity to legal entity level. And it prescribes a way of operating that can start to untangle those overlapping and intersecting incoherent legal fuzzinesses. So I think there has to be agreement making of some kind. It doesn't need to be a treaty. It doesn't need to be at the level of a state. So in Victoria, what we will see, the First Peoples Assembly has already articulated this, and nations can start applying for funding to support this. There will be statewide, because there are many Indigenous people living in Victoria who are not traditional owners. And then there will be nation-to-nation treaties. But it doesn't have to be a treaty form. It can be any kind of agreement making. I do think agreement making is crucial because that's the acknowledgement of the political entity that First Nations are. In the absence of that, I feel like the bare minimum that we could do is to respect their laws as laws. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we translate them into the settlers' legal system and start holding people to account by them. But instead of seeing Indigenous values that we then incorporate within our own systems, or we basically extract and then say, oh, we can tick those off if we do various things, we say these are legal orders. So how do we bridge? How do we work together? How do we connect across these legal orders to progress an outcome? So it's, we've got to get over the business of just getting their values and plugging them in to a settler framework. Yeah.
Talking of plugging values into settlement framework, I wanted to ask you about prospects for reconciling cultural flows and environmental flows, particularly within the context of basin plan. So we've seen a reform last year, restoring the Rivers Act, which frankly paid lip service to Indigenous water rights. But the conversation I had recently with Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder was basically our obligation is to enforce the Water Act. If cultural flows include a commercial use, we can't go there. Is there scope to get around that as you see it?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Let me just go back to this handy diagram. So it all depends really on what cultural flows mean in a given circumstance. And you see this same debate playing out in the cultural burn field. So a definition of cultural flows is a flow that delivers on cultural values. That is like the barest minimum definition. But that's within a settler state framework. You can release an environmental flow and tick off, yes, there's some shared benefits that come alongside of that. But arguably, that's not really a cultural flow. So my go-to answer for bureaucrats is often a cultural flow is water that Aboriginal people have control over to use for whatever they choose to. So that's the short version of this diagram. One of the things that this diagram also highlights for me is that these elements are all interconnected, but you don't, yeah, I think there's embedded in that question from the Commonwealth is that if you use it for cultural economy purposes, it is therefore not delivering healthy country. And I think that's the flaw in their thinking. We've got to stop pushing cultural economies into this purely commercial way of operating. One of the things that Water is Life actually does quite well, that Victorian document, is that it starts to set out under what circumstances it would make any kind of sense. And there's many arguments to say Aboriginal people should never pay fees and charges for water, right? But one of the things it does is to say, well, it's conceivable, and we can see this happening in different parts of Australia, not so much in Victoria, but in other parts of Australia, where an Aboriginal economic enterprise looks very much like a settler state economic enterprise. So they're a melon farm in the Northern Territory, for instance, and they've got the same kinds of water licenses as anybody else. So arguably it's still a cultural flow because it is an Aboriginal organisation doing what they want with it. But you could also say, well, it's easier to construct that as a purely commercial use of water because they're basically operating as it's indistinguishable from a settler state enterprise. I still have difficulty with that, and I suspect most of the time there is always an element of cultural economy. And in almost every Aboriginal business I've ever encountered, they are supporting community. So part of their production goes to supporting community. They'll be growing bush foods. They'll be doing things that bring in all of this into the cultural economy. So very, very rarely is it ever a purely commercial exercise. But if I had to jump into the MDBA and say, well, this might, or the TUO, and say, this would be how you'd overcome this problem, then I'd say, is it purely commercial? Because anything less than that seems perfectly valid because it will be contributing to healthy country. Every single water rights return in Victoria so far, Indigenous people have chosen to leave it in stream or in the ground because they are then exercising their agency with that water to care for country because they see that as the biggest challenge right now. They're not saying they won't do it in the future, that they might pump it out and do all kinds of things with it in the future. But this integrated approach and the difference between a cultural economy and a capitalist extractive economy, I think that's the answer for the TUO on this issue.
Yeah, you can apply an environmental economy argument as well.
Yeah, exactly.
To
Yeah, And ultimately, I think that's where it gets very complicated in the settler state context, because environmentalists and people who care about rivers, so me, and many of us here in the room, have had to fight so hard to get environmental water that the idea of saying maybe it supports all of these other things feels really uncomfortable, because then we're just basically saying, well, that's just the water resource management framework and we don't need environmental water anymore. So there's a bridging thing, and there's a political reality that you're sort of dealing with there. But the power of, again, this cultural water paradigm is that it says healthy country is part of all of this, and cultural economies are part of healthy country. People are part of healthy country. So healthy country creates space for people and cultural economies, as well as ecosystems. There's a great book by Ryan Emanuel, which I think is called On the Swamp, possibly In the Swamp. Anyway, he's a Lumbee man from North Carolina, and he talks about rivers and beavers. And in my kind of ecologically minded head, I've always been like, well, more beavers better. For the Lumbee and others along these rivers, actually the navigability of the river is crucial, and their definition, and they use different terms because healthy country is obviously an Aboriginal English term, but their definition of healthy country, healthy rivers, is a river that has space for people to navigate along it. So too many beavers is bad. And so there is, like, it was a really, reading that for me was a profound challenge to my understanding of, well, what is healthy country, and where are people in that, and what are our roles in that. But again, this is what this diagram is telling us. It's all interconnected. And this is, again, like Melissa Kennedy, one of the smartest people I know. This is a way of understanding the world differently.
Yep, there is one now.
Excellent. Okay, so from Stephanie, she says, can you speak to the issues around reduced overall water as a result of climate change, and how this might exacerbate the challenges in this process of addressing Aqua Nullius? How could contention in communities over access to water be addressed in the long run that attends to First Nations justice? So short-term, long-term problems here, right? If we have a scarcity mindset, then we're all fighting over scarce resources. Traditional owners are now another fighter in the ring. There's $100 million sitting there for them to go and buy water in the Murray-Darling Basin. There's, in that map that I had up before, there's just under 1.5 gigalitres in Northern Victoria sitting there waiting for them. I say waiting for them because there's a whole process with that, but anyway. So in the short term, there is a reallocation issue. In the long term, we can see this as a reallocation, right? This is a return of water because the water was stolen. So I think it actually helps us to talk about that, because then it can help people understand the longer term arrangements here. Again, in the longer term, I think this diagram helps us as well, because this is the conversation we're having with rural communities all the time. What does a viable future look like in the Murray-Darling Basin in the context of climate change? How do we keep healthy, thriving rural communities along healthy rivers? We know the importance of that. So Sue Jackson's work shows that when rivers flow, communities are less depressed, recidivism rates drop. Like, communities are happier and healthier. Well-being rises when rivers are healthier, which again is part of this. So I actually think that addressing Aqua Nullius, genuinely engaging with the cultural water paradigm, that is our long-term pathway to a viable, healthy, thriving future for all of us. It will look different. There will be transitions. There has to be a sharing of the benefits and a process to manage that so that people aren't left feeling like there are just winners and losers. That is no good. That is where we are right now, and that is the politicization of water in the Murray-Darling Basin. But this says maybe there's a different way. Maybe we can reimagine a future together in which we are all cared for. I think that's an abundance framing, and I like that a lot better. Oh, there's another question. I thank God we're not yet over time. So Camaria wants to know, given that Indigenous peoples do not understand linear time as we do in Western knowledge systems, do the nations you work with advocate for going back to a reference point in time to address some of the management issues that resulted from Aqua Nullius? How does understanding time help move this conversation forward? Okay, I'm just going to start by saying Indigenous peoples totally get linear time. I think what you were arguing or perhaps positing there was that they have different models of time. So deep time and recognizing the kind of circular relationship of people and place in time. This is now a space that I'm uncomfortable in because I cannot speak for Indigenous people. I will acknowledge that there are different ways of thinking about time. The reference point in time is a real, like that's a Western way of understanding what happened to the environment as a result of colonization, right? Like British invaded and a whole lot of processes, and we go back to that point in our heads to say, well, this is what a pristine ecosystem looks like. But most of those models are pristine. In fact, the very definition of pristine is absent of human. So what was in place 250 years ago was a gardened, curated, cared for landscape in which people and country co-created. Aboriginal people have never stopped co-creating with country. So they have been constrained in their ability to do that. They have been violently oppressed and limited in their ability to do that, but they have continued to exert their agency in that relationship and to claim that relationship to the extent that they can. So I don't think they see the change. They recognize that I've heard, obviously claims for compensation and things like that, but I don't hear an argument for going back in time. What I do hear is, what does it look like when we look forward? How do we change the trajectory of what we're on? So one of the mob that I'm working with is Birrarung people in central Victoria. They are creating a 100-year vision for some very degraded wetlands that exist within central Victoria. And it's actually incredible. It's powerful, it's beautiful, it's going to be incredibly difficult to achieve, but that's what they're looking at, is the 100 years. And I think that, again, gives us all the capacity to say, we don't actually have to solve things kind of completely in the next 5 or 10 years. What we can say is, how do we get to this distant future? So Wanganui iwi talk about the next 2 generations. They want to grow the next 2 generations of people with a completely different relationship with that river. And then that's when they will tackle things like hydropower in the river, because they think they'll have a generation of people whose relationship is so different they couldn't possibly accept decisions that have been made in the past. So I think that time question is, there's a generousness there that comes from a deep time perspective. I don't think Western science has, or Western culture, I don't think we have as settlers any kind of understanding of the depth of time that 65,000 years represents, or 120,000, which some of the evidence is pointing to. So, yeah.
Erin, this is the environmental mythology of the pristine state. The flip side, the Terra Nullius coin, and another form of violent dispossession.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think we need to be aware of and wary of fortress environmentalism, which continues to dispossess Aboriginal people. So I do a lot of work with the recognition of rights of rivers and rights of nature. And what is consistently apparent is that governments everywhere are more comfortable with the radical concept of recognizing a river as a person or a legal entity than they are in recognizing and upholding Indigenous rights. And that's just horrifying and heartbreaking, but yeah, that's where we are. We are just on time. So does anybody have any final questions? Like, we don't have to race off, but I imagine some people will need to.
I'll probably follow some of you quite specific. There's a challenge around the northern Victoria water rights. Sounds like it's about to be Victoria.
Sorry, it sounds like what?
The water rights.
Yeah.
Difficult?
Yes. So the northern, let me just go back to that slide. Oop. So across the top of Victoria, these, like all of those rivers are sort of in pink because they're water rights that were recovered as part of a massive investment in irrigation infrastructure efficiency that generated savings that were, some went to the Commonwealth under one set of agreements. They were shared 50-50 with irrigators in the Commonwealth. If we go back to, was 2007 when the Victorian government released its water plan to commit to doing this. They said we're going to recover 225 gigalitres, 75 goes to the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, which didn't exist at the time, so it was something else, but it was environment. 75 goes to irrigators and 75 goes to Melbourne. The politics of water coming into Melbourne means that the rules have now been changed. They will, under the current rules, that would never happen. You'd need Melbourne to be in the worst drought it's ever been in and Northern Victoria to be in 100%. So we've basically got 75, which is also going to irrigators because those water authorities in Melbourne who now formally own it can't use it. So the only thing they can do with it is put it on the water market. So as you can see, in none of those conversations were the rights of traditional owners. Zero. Back in, it was either 2020 or 2021, I think it was 2021, the Victorian government said, ta-da, not only have we found 225 gigalitres of savings, we found an extra 2. And we're so thrilled. Here's a press release, irrigators, it's all for you. Somewhat understandably, Mildred was a little miffed by that, as were many of the nations across Northern Victoria, because at that point, of course, the Victorian government, like initially, yes, back in 2007, First Nations not on the table, the Victorian government didn't have a Traditional Owner Settlement Act, it didn't have a whole bunch of policy pieces that it now has. But now, and since like 2015, it had significant commitments around how it was going to make decisions that it did not follow in issuing that water to irrigators. So we jumped up and down. I called the minister a hypocrite, which you can find in articles. And they were very unhappy about that. And then they subsequently found another 2 gigalitres of savings. And tied themselves in various little policy knots around how do we hand out these 2 gigalitres of savings. So the reason why it's 1.36 gigalitres in Northern Victoria is because they said, well, what if we just lean on the Melbourne water retailers and the Victorian Environmental Water Holder to give up their share? We'll pretend that everything still has to go through a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and we'll just, as it happens, and I am not, I believe that they issued the press release without actually confirming with the Victorian Environmental Water Holder and the Melbourne water retailers that that was the way they were framing it. That creates some legal problems for the Victorian Environmental Water Holder because they've effectively given up environmental water to First Nations to use for whatever they would like. So anyway, nobody's chosen to pursue that legal challenge, so yay. 1.36 gigalitres is currently being held by the Victorian government on trust for nations in Northern Victoria. 1.36 is not an insignificant amount of water, but when you think about the fact that there are probably 20 nations across Northern Victoria, some of whom have formal state status and some of whom don't, how do you share that up? Like, does everybody just get, 70 megalitres? Like, what do we do here? And of course, it's a mix of high and low reliability. Some of it can be linked to specific rivers in that system and some not. And so some of it, like a lot of it comes out of, coming out of Eildon. So that's on Birrarung country. And so Birrarung was saying the water falls in our country, maybe it's all of our water. And then it flows through Jar Jar and Yorta Yorta, and like there is complexity in terms of who has the right claim to that water. There is no easy way to resolve that complexity, which is why that water has not been handed out yet. But I think the straightforward way of resolving that is to say, this is a first step. If you have to you have to take 1.36 and go, right, this is the only water you will ever get, so we have to get it right, then yes, it becomes incredibly painful and, you'll be doing this for decades. And you'll be fighting over scraps, which is the worst thing to do. But if you say this is a first step, maybe we take expressions of interest. So one of the key principles of Water is Life was to say, no one gets left behind. So government has to raise all boats, it has to invest in all traditional owners to make sure that they are all able to engage with these opportunities. But nobody gets held back either. like both of those things. And they came from traditional owners to say, like, we recognize we are all operating at different levels. And those of us who are further progressed can't wait and shouldn't wait for everybody to get to the same level, unless it's a circumstance in which their taking of an opportunity means that that opportunity no longer exists. This is not one of those cases. There will be more water. So I think it's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a failure of bureaucracy, I think, to failure to be brave enough to say there will be more. So we can just start this process. What matters is that mob get experience, those who want it, in holding and dealing and making decisions about water rights, because most of them haven't done that before. And having the enormous healing power and the satisfaction of having water that is your own for traditional owners it's huge. And so again, that's the sort of thing that this could start to deliver for people, if they just get it out the door. But yeah, but it's complicated, and yeah, we're watching this space.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Erin. That was really, really fantastic. I'm sure that everybody would agree with me on that. Thank you, Erin.